Okay, so today's lecture is basically about the transformation of class in the decades following the Second World War. Class is something that most people associate with Britain, whether they live in Britain or, more particularly, if they visit. Most people associate Britain with a certain rigid class system. And class has certainly been thought of as a sort of structuring experience of modern British history. The emergence of a tripartite class system characterized by the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie or the middle class, and the working class was seen for a very long time to be the driving force of historical change in Britain. People have used it to explain the revolution of 1688, the emergence of the Enlightenment culture in the 18th century, industrialization, democratization, and so on and so on. Now, this understanding of class as being central to the unfolding of British history isn't just a product of Marxism, although it's clearly rooted in a Marxist analysis. But historians of all types basically accept the prevalence of class and often use class as a primary explanatory framework for understanding the passage of history in Britain. In the context of this lecture, the working class is seen particularly as playing a central role in any account of the rise and fall of social democracy. The working class is commonly understood to be a product of the forms of industrialization that unfolded from the late 18th century. It's seen to be a product of the emergence of the organized labor movement in the 19th and early 20th century. And it's also seen to be a product of a particular type of working class culture, of a homogeneous working class culture, characterized famously by the historian Eric Hobsbawm as the working class man with a flat cap and a whippet and a pint of beer by his side. Now, social democracy is often seen and explained as the product of the triumph of the working class interest. And the story normally goes that it's the rising standards of living and affluence from the 1950s that erodes some key elements of that working class interest and experience, and indeed ends up producing a new set of politics with a different set of priorities and solidarities that in the end undermine social democracy itself. So today, basically, my task is to have a look at this argument and see how adequate it is, and whether indeed we can understand post-war British history as being characterized by a lessening of class differences or a reconfiguration of them. So the key question is, does class disappear or does it change shape? Is class still there in the Britain of the 1970s, 80s, 90s, or does it just look and sound different? Now, of course, you can't simply tell any story of a particular class without thinking about their relationship to the two other classes that are commonly held to exist, namely, in this case, the middle class and the aristocracy. There's a parallel story, of course, about the reshaping of the aristocracy and the middle classes in this years. The aristocracy becomes less associated with landowning and hereditary titles than about a new type of social elite characterized by a particular cultural style as much as by their wealth. And we've already seen in the past lectures that the aristocracy is on display in new types of ways in post-war Britain, at the coronation, at the debutante balls of high society in the 1950s. But the aristocracy also increasingly gets enmeshed with the upper middle classes. There's a blurring of the boundaries between those two groups. And we think of this particularly in terms of the emergence of a new type of cultural elite in Britain. A cultural elite with its homes in the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, in the civil service, and in the BBC. Indeed, a figure Noel Annan wrote a book called Our Age, in which he talked about a new type of intellectual aristocracy taking shape in Britain in the post-war period. And this convergence was also remarked upon in a very famous book called The Anatomy of Britain, published in 1962 by a South African intellectual, Anthony Sampson. There's also the story of the reformation of the middle classes. And again, we've seen elements of that in the previous lectures with the growth of the technical and professional salaried workers of the warfare and welfare state, the slow expansion of higher education, the emergence of new forms of middle-class domesticity made possible by the increasing prevalence of consumer durables and the decline of domestic service, and the rise of home ownership. But the focus on this lecture, as I said, is going to be basically on whatever happened to the so-called traditional working class. And I'm going to try and map that today by looking at the ways in which that class was thought of and understood in the work of sociology, politics, and culture. So let me turn first to the social scientific study of class. Now, the first thing I want to say here is that the traditional working class was, of course, always associated not just with men, and that's very important, but with industrial manufacturing and the organization of industrial workers by trade unions. And the thing that you need to note from the figures you can see behind me is that in these key groups, there's very little change from really the 1930s or the 1950s through to the 1970s. The key part of the of the workforce here, you can see the industrial sector only shrunk by 500,000 between 1951 and 1971. The big drop-off is, of course, in the decades following 1971. Similarly, if you look at the trade unionship, the figures for the membership of trade unions, you can see that, in fact, in 1979, there are more members of trade unions than there ever had been before. Trade union membership actually peaks in 1979 at 12 million. But one key sector of the traditional working class was, of course, unskilled manual workers. And these we do see beginning to decline in the decades after the Second World War. They fall basically from 70% in 1931 to 47% by 1974. Nonetheless, what I'm trying to get across to you in these figures is that measured in terms of the experience of work, there seems to be no disappearance of the working class at all. So how is it that we are going to be engaged in a conversation about the supposed disappearance of the traditional working class? Where did all of this talk of the strange death of the working class come from? Yeah. Sure. Oh, the figures are very compressed. I'm sorry about that. Okay? So where did all of this talk come from? Well, in important ways, it comes from the work of social scientists and sociologists. Sociology as a discipline actually comes of age in Britain in the post-war period. It's at this point that you see the establishment and the growth of departments of sociology throughout universities in Britain, as you see the growth of the discipline of anthropology in universities in the post-war period. These two disciplines were thought of as key ways of understanding the changing structure of society in the post-war period, and in terms of anthropology, the changing structure of colonial society. And both of these disciplines were very heavily supported and funded by the new welfare state. And one of the things that in terms of domestic sociology that goes on is the attempt to try and study the new locations and forms of working class life. One of the key things that they have to grapple with is literally the physical relocation of the working class. Between 1945 and 1975, 1.3 million slums were destroyed. And many of those traditional working class neighborhoods, many of the inhabitants of those neighborhoods were relocated to new dormitory towns or to new areas within cities. So there's a physical change, which is, I think, important. The other key element here was those studies that try to look at the way in which poverty, a key characteristic of working class experience, was disappearing. So CBAM Rowntree, who you will remember starts this all off in 1901 with his study of York, has a return study in 1951 called Poverty and the Welfare State that shows that just 3% of the population were now living below the poverty line, whereas in 1901 he had discovered that over 30% of the population were living in poverty. And this was widely seen to be, by people like Rowntree, as a product of the very new welfare services that had been established in the post-war period. Workers, it seemed, were becoming better off. Workers, it seemed, were benefiting from the improved standards of living and the increasingly affluent society that Britain was becoming in the 1950s and the 1960s. And the key question is, what did this do to their understanding of class? So last week I gave you some sections of Goldthorpe's The Affluent Worker to read, published in 1968. It's a very, very important study, grounded in the investigation of two areas, Luton and Cambridge, and of car workers in those two towns, undertaken in the early 1960s. So although the publication it's not published until 68, much of the research is grounded in the early 1960s. What Goldthorpe and his collaborators find was a new type of working class, a working class that looked really different from its predecessors, because they had basically been what Goldthorpe described as effectively privatized. They'd withdrawn to a new type of private domain of the house, of the household, and was no longer associated with the traditional forms of working class sociability. And part of the reason for that withdrawal was that they were trying to maximize their income and their standard of living. The job for them was a key defining feature of social improvement. It wasn't that they were experiencing deprivation in any profound way, but they had basically withdrawn to this new type of suburban lifestyle, withdrawn from the pub and the social halls that had characterized working class sociability and solidarity before. But interesting, Goldthorpe thought that this new type of affluent worker, even though he looked very different from his predecessors, hadn't withdrawn their support from the Labour Party, which of course was seen to be the political party most associated with advancing the interests of the working class. These types of studies were in some ways contradicted by a different set of sociological work. This group of work, which I think is best represented in these two texts you can see at the bottom here, Wilmot and Young's Family and Kinship in East London, and Smith and Townsend's The Poor and the Poorest, tried to understand how it is that poverty had to be understood in new ways in the newly affluent Britain. So whereas Rowntree and his followers had always understood poverty in absolute terms, that is to say that there was an income level below which, if you dropped, you couldn't afford the necessaries of life, now these sociologists began to advance a new type of understanding of poverty, one that we still live with today, as basically relative. That is to say that it wasn't necessarily about the lack of necessities, it was now about the lack of commodities that allowed you to fully participate in the new affluent society. So it might be a TV, it might be a telephone, it might be a washing machine. Okay? And that the absence of these goods basically made people poor in a new type of way because they were unable to fully participate in the new forms of social life. This is a definition of poverty that is now often termed social exclusion. People are socially excluded from certain forms of participation in social life. These studies basically said that somewhere between 14%, something like 14% of the population were now on low incomes that placed them in this new category of the relatively poor. And that most importantly, those people, a key sector of of that group, 2 million of the 7.5 million of them, were children and old age pensioners, seniors, what we call at the US as seniors. New groups, new non-governmental organizations like Help the Aged and Shelter and the Child Poverty Action Group, set up all in the 1960s, I think I mentioned them briefly to you last week, were all established to try and advance the interests of these new groups, and critically to challenge the argument that the welfare state had provided universal care for everybody. They were trying to say that despite the universal claims of the welfare state, these three critical groups, the aged, the homeless, and children, remain disadvantaged within the welfare state. Old age pensioner. Now, it's in the context of this debate that the marvelous documentary series, the so-called Up series, starting with 7 Up in 1964, began. Okay? And I hope you've all watched clips of at least some of it, because we're going to end up talking about it at the end of the lecture. But let me just explain where this fits. The Up series is basically an intervention into this debate about the changing forms of class in Britain. It was put on by World in Action, a documentary series that was the flagship documentary series for independent television, which of course had only recently been established and which was trying to cement its credentials as putting on serious TV. And the idea of the program was a very familiar one in terms of social scientists. It was to take a cross-section of the population, a cross-section of 7-year-old children, and determine how far their class position at birth would determine their life outcomes. Now, you'll already be aware that that cross-section that they took now looks a rather strange cross-section in terms of the British population. There's only one person of colour in the documentary series. There's a pretty much a balance between men and women, and there's very few members of the so-called middle classes. Conceivably, there's only 2 or 3 people who fit that category of the middle class. The predominant focus of the documentary in 1964 was of the working classes and of the upper middle classes, the sort of social elite, the people going to private school and imagining their life projected forward to Oxford and Cambridge and so forth and so forth. Now, the key issue that I want to talk about at the end of the lecture is whether this series, which is still running, 56 Up, came out in 2013, just a few months ago, whether this documentary series proves the defining assumptions that it began with, whether the class differences within this group of people seems to have lessened or whether they're still firmly in place. Okay, let's move on to class and the question of politics, or politics and the... Well, sorry, that will come on in a moment. I wasn't expecting that. Now, many of these debates about class and classlessness or the reformation of class were animated by very pressing political issues. Effectively, the key issue at debate here is why the Conservative Party had become the de facto party of government during much of the 20th century. Remember that Baldwin and the Conservative Party dominates the period after the advent of democracy in 1918 and 1928, and similarly, in the post-war period, the Conservatives are in power for 13 years, from 1951 through to 1964, a feat that they achieve again after the election of Mrs. Thatcher in 1979, and they hold power all the way through to 97. Now, for most social scientists, this seemed like a contradiction, that an electorate characterized by a predominance of the working classes should have been voting for their class interest and voting for the Labour Party. But this hadn't happened. So the question was, how come this has happened? Was it about the working class having lost its tribal loyalty to the labour movement? Or was it that the working class was, in fact, just disappearing? So while sociologists focused about the question of the working class disappearing, the political scientists and politicians tried to figure out why it was that the working class voted for the Conservative Party. What animated the working class embrace of conservatism? Was it, they suggested, just old-fashioned class deference, that the working class thought that the aristocracy should be their rulers and therefore deferentially kept on electing them? Was it the embrace of nationalism and racism? And we've already begun to see the way in which the Conservative Party picks up the issue of immigration in the 1960s. Or was it, as I talked about after the Second World War, the desire for new types of consumer goods and the idea that the Conservative Party embraced the aspirations of the working class to enter the world of goods? Now, there's a very famous depiction of the working class conservative in a television series called Till Death Do Us Part, which ran from 1965 to 1975, and which I think you need to understand in the context of these debates. And I'll show you a quick clip of Alf Garnett at work. Oops, well, I will if I can come back and press this.
That's marvellous, that, isn't it? Hey, Lovely, that, isn't it? Hey? It's really lovely, that. Isn't it?
Hides that goat patch nice.
Who is it? They're not relations of yours, are they?
No, Mr. Funny Guts, they ain't. For your information, that is your 4 generations. A picture of historical rarity.
Yeah? Where'd you get it? Sotheby's?
No, I did not. I got it where I got a picture of him. And him.
In the junk shop.
Yes, in a junk shop. Where all of England's great men end up. And all of England's great history. Covered in cobwebs. But we will rise again. Don't you worry about that. We will rise like lions and get our empire back. The bloody great British Empire that your bloody Labour rubbish give away to.
To the people it belonged to.
To a load of bloody coons and wogs. Made such a muck up, maybe they had to come over here and scrounge all from us.
God, here we go. Packy bashing again.
Look.
Don't start him off.
Oh, me?
Look.
You know he don't like 'em.
I don't like them. I don't like them.
Well, you don't.
They don't bloody like each other. So why should I bloody well like them? God blimey, that was at his other's throats only a little while ago. I mean, there's one half of them trying to shoot and starve the other half. So don't talk to me about not liking them.
Look, that was a religious war, that was.
Oh, yeah, go on, blame it on God. Blame it on God. Ain't it marvellous? Anything that happens these days, it's his fault, isn't it? Eh? Blame it on that man. God blimey. I bet he's beginning to wish he'd never made us now.
So you see Alf Garnett, classic traditional working class man in the East End of London, the Cockney, embracing the Conservative Party, the idea of the British Empire, and the racism that came with it. And there's a very uneasy way in which people sort of laugh with or laugh at that racism in the 60s and the 70s. So the issue then was Must Labour Lose, which was the title of a pamphlet written by Labour's chief market research public opinion pollster, a man called Mark Abrams, in 1959. And there seemed to be a drift away from the Labour Party. The Daily Herald, which you'll remember was the one party that was a supporter of the Labour Party, owned by the trade union movement from the 1930s, became The Sun, Britain's most famous tabloid, now in 1959, and embraced the Conservative Party. The Labour Party lost its last newspaper that supported it. So in these conditions, what happens is you try and have a repackaging of the Labour Party, an attempt to try and rethink of its position and its relationship to the electorate and to the working class particularly. So part of that began in the 1950s in the heat of these debates, and it happened with the figures around Hugh Gaitskell, who had become the leader of the Labour Party, beating Aneurin Bevan in the early 50s. And his chief ideologue, Anthony Crosland, who wrote this famous book called The Future of Socialism in 1956, which has become of abiding influence to members of the Labour Party, including some of its current leaders. What Crosland did was to say, look, socialism isn't about equality in absolute terms. Rather, socialism has to be, the socialism of the Labour Party has to be about equality of opportunity. Not simple material equality, but equality of opportunity. And that this was primarily going to be achieved by giving people equal access to forms of social mobility. So for Crosland, education was a key mechanism for the achievement of educational opportunity. It was, of course, in this time that the Labour Party is also repackaging itself in terms of its presentational skills, which we saw in a lecture a couple of weeks ago, or last week. When the Labour Party returns to power in 1964, it does so under Harold Wilson, and what Wilson does is promise to modernise the country. He basically embraces the Crosslandite ethos, and he says we're going to modernise the country by use of the white heat of technology, the new use of technology to modernise Britain's failing industrial base, and the expansion of education. Crossland becomes his education secretary, and he introduces a number of key reforms, not least of which was the embrace of the Robbins Report, which had come out in 1963, calling for a doubling of the number of university students within a decade. And indeed, this is achieved. In 1962, there had been 118,000 undergraduates, that's just 8% of the age group. By 1971, there were 457,000 undergraduates, which was about 14% of the population. But arguably, more critically, what Crossland does is to try and create a new form of secondary education. Remember that the 1944 Education Act had streamed people into these 3 schools by way of the 11+. Crossland gets rid of this, and he introduces a new comprehensive school system that would try and build together all of the qualities of technical schools and grammar schools and the secondary modern school. Indeed, Crossland said that he wanted comprehensive schools to become grammar schools for all. And they were educating 88% of school children by 1980. Very important compromise here, though, was the failure to abolish private school, which was on the agenda for the Labour Party, but they shied away from. So that's the first way in which the Labour Party try and repackage themselves in the 1950s and the 1960s. Fast forward a decade, when the Labour Party is again in the electoral wilderness after the election of Mrs. Thatcher, and you have the same type of rethinking going on about how it is that the Labour Party can recapture the support of the working classes. And here, the key conduit for it was this magazine, which was actually the magazine of the British Communist Party, called Marxism Today. And in particular, the work of 2 intellectuals, Stuart Hall, a sociologist, and Martin Jacques, a journalist. And they came up with an idea that Britain in the 1980s was living in what they described as new times, which was effectively the transition to a new type of post-Fordist economy and the existence of globalization and of identity politics. So I'll read you a brief quote from their key article. Mass production, the mass consumer, the big city, the big brother state, the sprawling housing estate, and the nation state are all in decline. Flexibility, diversity, differentiation, mobility, communication, decentralization, and internationalization are in the ascendant. In the process, our own identities, our own sense of self, our own subjectivities are being transformed. We are in a transition to a new era. And the Labour Party basically had to grapple with how to relaunch itself in this new era. And it did so over the course of a decade and a half under the leadership first of Neil Kinnock, that you heard during his speech against Mrs. Thatcher in 1983, then a man called John Smith, and then finally, and most importantly, with the election of Tony Blair as its leader in 1994, and the emergence or the rebranding of the Labour Party as the New Labour Party, which came to abandon its commitment to the nationalisation of of industries. So here we have 2 examples of the Labour Party trying to respond to these to this shifting sense of what had happened to the working class and why it wasn't getting elected. Any questions before I move on to this last section? Yeah, Mary.
I heard that one of the Labour Party happened from the 1980s. I want to say it was the 1987.
Mm-hmm.
It was has the longest suicide note in history.
Yeah, indeed. It's the 1983 election. The 1983 election, they have a leader called Michael Foot, who was on the left of the Labour Party, was one of the people who had founded the Keep Left movement in the 1950s against American influence and wanting to keep Britain non-aligned. He was a great admirer of Aneurin Bevan. Michael Foot and Neil Kinnock and Aneurin Bevan thought of themselves as a continuous part on the left of the Labour Party. And one of the reasons why the Labour Party's manifesto in 1983 was considered to be the longest suicide note in history was that it still embraced the nationalisation of industries, and it was committed to nuclear disarmament, to unilateral nuclear disarmament in the age, of course, of Reagan and Thatcher and the intensification of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. In 1983, the Labour Party wanted to undo all the reforms that Margaret Thatcher had done in her first period of government. Good call, Malik. Sorry. Still, it was a good call, even though I got your name wrong. Okay, let's move on to this last section, which is about culture and its role in rethinking and reassembling the working class. Now, the first thing that I want to say here is there's a sort of paradox that is taking place. There's a paradox in the sense that at the time that the working class is supposedly disappearing, it becomes increasingly culturally visible in the 1960s and the 1970s. And that increasing visibility is really about a certain set of cultural politics that take shape in that period to try and breathe new life into the traditional white working class. What I'm suggesting to you is that basically in the 1960s and the 1970s, the working class is remade culturally at the point when it seems to be disappearing socially, economically, and politically. And you have to understand almost all of these cultural politics as a reaction against three key things: the rise of affluence, the influence of Americanization, of American cultural life, and probably most importantly, colonial migration and the populating of Britain with people of colour. All of these three elements, these people thought were threatening the traditional working class. So the first cultural project that I'm going to talk about is fiction, and the emergence of a new genre of novel known in the 1950s, characterized by or known as a literature that propagated a new type of figure, the angry young man. The angry young man was a sort of composite figure, a composite figure that expressed the sort of dislocation of young working class people in a world of upward social mobility. They were caught between two worlds, neither the world of the old working class of the 1920s and the 1930s, nor of the new affluent families of the 50s and the 60s. And they were reacting against the confines of both culture. They were reacting against the confines of their working class families, that expected them to behave in particular types of ways, and of their continuing exclusion from what they saw as the growing world of middle-class privilege. And they also felt that they had missed the boat politically. In the words of Jimmy Porter, the main character in John Osborne's Look Back in Anger, which was a play in 1956, he said, "There are no good causes left." So these people are at sea, these angry young men. The key novels that you should read if you like this type of stuff is Colin Wilson's The Outsider, which is a sort of horrible British version of Jean-Paul Sartre, a sort of embrace of existentialism in a rather unfortunate way. Brain's Room at the Top comes out in 1957, and my own personal favourite, Alan Sillitoe's Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, which comes out in 1958. All of these novels become hugely popular and are made into films. And I'm going to show you a clip because I adore this movie. This is of Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, the trailer for it. It's a brilliant movie. It's a brilliant novel. This isn't the trailer.
Take a good look at this face. Remember this name. You'll remember them both for a long time to come. In a motion picture you will not soon forget. This is the picture Time magazine calls the best British movie since Room at the Top. The New York Times calls it brilliant, so clarified and concentrated that it excites, delights, and hurts. And goes on to say, Albert Finney, a new sensation of the British stage and screen, is a very exceptional specimen. One of the most vigorous of recent pictures, says the New York Herald Tribune. A very exceptional film, a gem of the naturalistic style.
You know the trouble with you? You don't know the difference between right and wrong. And I don't think you ever will.
Maybe I won't, but I don't want anybody to teach me either.
Brilliant film, you really must see it, especially if you've only seen Albert Finney in Skyfall, looking a shadow of his former self. He's absolutely fantastic in this movie. Melody's not here today, is she? There's another fun fact about this movie, which is that one of my favourite bands, the Arctic Monkeys, took the title for their first album, Whatever You Say I Am, That's What I'm Not, from a line of Albert Finney's in this film. And the Arctic Monkeys are certainly the sort of 2000 version of the Angry Young Men, or at least they were with that album. Okay, now let's get to the boring stuff, which is a return to people like me, to academics. The remaking of Class as a sort of cultural project doesn't just happen through films and novels. It happens in terms of the study, the emergence of new types of subdisciplines in the academy. New disciplines that come out in important ways shaped by the very people that are elevated out of the working class, by, if you like, the academic version of the literary angry young men. And it all begins in 1957 with the publication of Richard Hoggart's The Uses of Literacy that you can see behind me. Hoggart's book is an account of the community and culture of his working class neighborhood in Leeds in the 1920s and the 1930s. And the corrosive influence on that community of course, you've guessed it, commercialized, Americanized mass culture. It's a very moving book, which is really a sort of nostalgic evocation of the sort of loss and mourning of that community and of his own position, of the relocation of his own position, because he was sent to a grammar school as a scholarship boy before the war. And the last chapter of the book is actually about people like him who are educated out of their class. And it's called Anxious and Uprooted. Just like Angry Young Men, Hoggart felt that these scholarship boys now belonged to no class. They couldn't return back to the traditional working class that they'd come from, and neither could they fully enter the world of the intellectual aristocracy that they were now surrounded by. It's not insignificant that the image on the front of this edition of The Uses of Literacy was taken from the work of L.S. Lowry. Lowry was an artist in the north of England who became very popular in the 1950s for his images of these so-called stick figures of people dwarfed in the old industrial landscapes of the Northwest around factories and mills and warehouses. This world was, of course, disappearing very fast in the 1950s and the 1960s, and as it was disappearing, Lowry's work became increasingly popular. He was even offered a knighthood, which, to his great credit, he declined. Now, it wasn't just people like Lowry, like Hoggart, who received this new type of education out of their class. The expansion of the university system in the 1960s meant that for the first time you have members of the working class going to university in very small numbers. These people very often become the leading intellectual figures in the formation of the New Left in the 1960s and involved in the student protests and the student movements of the 1960s. They also go on to have a very important role in creating new subdisciplines, and I'm going to talk about two in particular. The first is cultural studies, and the other is social history itself. So Richard Hoggart, after the great success of The Uses of Literacy, ends up setting up at the University of Birmingham the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, where he works in association with Stuart Hall, the man who in the 80s wrote New Times in Marxism Today, and is probably Britain's most preeminent sociologist to this day. The Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies did something that was unbelievably unique at that time. It basically gave birth to the discipline of cultural studies, and it took seriously the study of contemporary cultural life. That is to say, it sought to move away from the old left critique of commercialized culture and to try and take it seriously on its own terms and to understand its resonance and meaning and importance to social life. Equally, a new discipline that emerges at this time is social history. Social history had been around for a while. Indeed, the first position in social history was at my old alma mater, the University of Manchester, in 1959. But in 1968, it sort of comes of age when Edward Thompson, probably Britain's most famous historian, along with Eric Hobsbawm to this day, formed the Centre for the Study of Social History at the University of Warwick. Now, just as the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies took seriously the culture of the working class, took seriously the study of popular culture, so social history tried to take seriously the social lives of working class people. But it also did more than that. It also, I would suggest, tried to recuperate, to reanimate an understanding of the centrality of class experience. What these disciplines therefore tried to do was to focus upon recovering working class culture and working class history as a way of trying to energize the working class in the present by saying, look, here's your history of activism. Now we must regather and reshape and have a new era of working class activism in the present. The most definitive text in this regard was Edward Thompson's own book, The Making of the English Working Class, published in 1963. But this movement also spawns a whole series of other types of cultural projects. The History Workshop movement is formed in 1968 to try and engage in what it calls people's history. You know, very in the spirit of Harold Zinn, of trying to find what the people's history was, to provide a counterweight to the traditional narratives of historical study through the study of ordinary people. And it was thought of to be a very democratic practice of history. It encouraged workers to do studies of their own families, of their own workplaces, and was a hugely important intellectual formation, which, as you'll find out next week, gives birth to the new forms of feminism in Britain in the early 1970s. But it wasn't just within academic history, within academic disciplines that this stuff happened. There was also a revival of the folk movement, of interest in folk songs and the performance of folk songs that was very much part of this. The practice of oral history was a consequence of this movement, of community publishing and community theatre, of people being able to, and of community arts, of people putting on their own, publishing their own writing, putting on their own plays and their own artistic performance, all with the idea of trying to break down the old cultural hierarchies to say, look, the art and theatre and writing of ordinary people is just as important as those of the social elite. And of course, many of those forms of activity re-cemented the image of a traditional working class. So, for instance, there's a very famous book called The Classic Slum, published in 1971 by a man called Robert Roberts, which came out of the adult education program at the University of Manchester and looked back to his working class childhood in Salford, next to Manchester, in the early 20th century. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that all of these cultural projects look back to a traditional working class. And it's not at all unimportant that the traditional working class that they look back to was uniformly, I should say, the white working class. Now, as much as there are all of these attempts to try and give voice to the working class experience and to emphasize the Englishness and the whiteness of that working class, that was, of course, created a whole set of people whose historical experience was effectively excluded from that script. So as class becomes increasingly visible and increasingly used as a way of trying to think about the past and the present by these intellectuals, so it generates a whole series of critiques against it. Feminists begin to take shape in Britain in arguing against the prevalence of class analysis and the way in which it neglects the position of women. Gay and lesbian politics similarly emerges in part as an argument against the prevalence of class, and of course, equally critical, the emergence of black nationalism in Britain in the late 60s and early 1970s. Three key areas of social experience and of a new type of politics that this type of narrative completely neglected. There's a final irony to all of this, which is that as new cultural ways of thinking about class became predominant, so class began to be understood as not grounded in a social and economic position, as not grounded even in any political ideology, but as being effectively formed by culture itself. That is to say, class became thought of as primarily a cultural category. And as it did so, it was something that people thought could be performed. It became, if you like, almost a stylized form of social performance. So the song that I began this class with, Pulp's Common People, is about this rich middle-class woman wanting to sleep with common people, wanting to be part of the common people, and thinking that she could, wear the clothes and talk in the accent and become, fashionably common. Okay, and the song is obviously about the impossibility or the absurdity of that image. The point is basically once class seems to disappear as a type of social and economic form of exclusion, it becomes almost fashionable to be working class. Any questions before I wrap this up? Yeah.
When you say that as class became less of a mode of social exclusion in the society during the 60s and 70s,
Mm-hmm.
was there ever, like similar to like what some people said in America, especially in like New Zealand and Australia, the idea of a classless society?
Mm-hmm.
So that notion was just, no, this is so unfair.
Well, I think that there have been various attempts, as I've tried to show, to think that Britain is moving to a type of classless society, or at least to understand the ways in which class is fundamentally reshaping. And that is a perfect key and perfect setup, I think, for the conclusion of this lecture, and for what I want to hear about you in terms of your take upon whether class is present or absent in the increasingly present or absent in the Ups series. The one thing I do want to say before we get to that discussion is that in a way I would argue that the very finest achievement of social democracy, the social democratic system of the post-war years, was that the traditional male working class did effectively disappear. It is no longer possible in Britain to think of that traditional working class as having, in any sense, a presence in the way in which it had in the 1940s or even the 1950s. There's no doubt that people's standards of living and cultural expectations have changed, and that traditional working class is no more. The question is whether that means the class system as a whole has disappeared, or whether it simply changed shape, changed voice, and changed look. And I do want to emphasize that social inequality in Britain remains very, very profound. In 2009, there was an official report called Fair Access to the Professions that came out that showed, for instance, that 7% of those, that 7% of the population educated at private schools that now then cost about £30,000 a year, so £50,000 a year before tax. This tiny percentage of the population came to occupy 56% of lawyers, 70% of financial directors, and 75% of judges in British society. That even though the average annual pre-tax income in Britain was £25,000, £25,000 is the average annual income, 80% of the population earn less than £35,000 a year, and 1% earn more than £100,000 a year. And just as in the 1960s, 13.4 million people are living on low incomes, earning as much as 60% less than the 25,000 average annual income. So poverty and inequality remains a very central part of British society to this day. But, as you can see in the new study that has just come out, the BBC's Great British Class Survey, there is increasing uncertainty about what to make of the British class system. This new survey, conducted by sociologists at the University of Manchester, has now come up with 7 different categories of class: the elite, the established middle class, the technical middle class, newly affluent workers, emergent service workers, the traditional working class, and what they call the precariat. Okay? And the interesting thing about these 7 distinctions is not just that the tripartite structure of class is seen to be no longer very useful because there are too many categories in the middle. It is that class is defined not just in terms of wealth or the possession of goods, but in what they call social and cultural capital. Access to forms of cultural and social activity that are key to forms of social mobility. So I'll give you one classic example that is associated with this study, okay, which you're all deeply familiar with: the rise of internships, of unpaid labour for university graduates to go and have a starter position in a company. These things are particularly prevalent, for instance, in the world of TV and broadcasting. Okay? It is only the people, the middle class, upper middle class people who come out of universities, who have parents who can afford to support them when they take unpaid labour, or who have connections with people in the business, who get to have access to the world of TV and broadcasting in Britain. So in many ways, that area is a really good example in which there still remains a type of intellectual aristocracy that social and cultural capital is very, very important for. Okay, so I want to end by not talking and by getting your sense of the 7-Up series, and whether you feel there is a sense in which class disappears in the making of that program. As you can see from this fabulous image, you know, you can see the way in which all of the characters literally change over the years, from 7 down to 49. And we can either use these characters to talk about, or we can talk about any of the others. This is, of course, Tony, the East End cab driver. This is, what the hell is this? Bruce, the son of missionaries who's privately educated and ends up working as a teacher first in London and then at a private school. This is, whoops, I've lost my, this is Jackie, who is one of the 3 working class daughters who all interviewed together. It's not Jackie, is it? What is it? It's Lynn. It's Lynn, who becomes a librarian and has a couple of daughters. Who is this one? This is, of course, Neil, the Liverpudlian, one of the very few middle-class people in the sample who goes to grammar school, lives in a squat in London in the 1970s, ends up as homeless, and then becomes an elected official standing for the Liberal Democrats, having never had a other form of paid employment. And this is Simon, who is the only person of colour in the entire series, a product of a mixed-race relationship. Whose mother he's taken out of an orphanage, basically, because his single mother dies when he's young, and he goes through a couple of marriages and has a whole bunch of kids, and reflects upon the position of black, the changing position, or his changing relationship to blackness in British society. So you can take those figures, or you can take anyone else to say, well, does class become less present in their life? Who wants to start us off? We've got 10 minutes to talk about this, and I will keep you here for 10 minutes, so you might as well talk. Yeah, what's your name? Katie. Right. I think this is Susie, whose parents separate when she's young. She goes through the chain smoking phase. Yeah. And then at the end, I watched 49 Right. Yeah. Where I was actually talking about wanting to go back to school, like get a better education, that she can have a conversation with anyone in the world and know what she's talking about. Right. And I thought that was really interesting. She started from like a working class background, and it feels like she now has like opportunities that she wouldn't have. Oh, hang on. I think we're talking about the wrong person. Where is she interviewed by herself, or is she part of the three girls that are interviewed together in the beginning? I think part of the three girls. Oh, okay. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. So, and you feel like she does have more, that she's disproved the point of the program, which is people remain locked in their class position? No, I feel like she feels like that. Right. Because she was saying, like, I don't think that I turned out how you thought I was going to. I think that you wanted to slot me in somewhere. Right. Right. And she's living in Scotland in a high rise and has bad arthritis. Do any of her children go to university? Right. They are. They're all. But in the next one, they're not, and they don't. Yeah. They all sit. Those three boys, those three posh boys, all sit on the thing and say, "Yes. Well, when I finished here, I'm going to go to Cambridge, and then I'm going to go and they all do, and they all remarkably do. But there's only really two middle-class people in the whole series. One is Neil, who is the grammar school kid from Liverpool, who has a year in university and then drops out, and the other is the person who is called Neil, who is the guy who comes from a farm in Yorkshire. And ends up being an academic in the US, rather scarily familiar to me, and is also about the same age. Anybody else? So you're saying basically they're still locked in their class position? Yeah.
Well, I noticed that the three upper class kids that said when I get out of school, the dude was also a working class kid who had the same ideas. Not necessarily to the university, just to the plan.
Right.
Be a job for professors, be a cash job.
Right.
And he does.
Right.
And I think that I don't see how that relates to sticking in class, but how certain individuals have a plan of what they
Right. Right. But the argument of the program, whether you buy it or not, is that the vision that you have of your life is constrained by your class position. So Tony can only think For him, becoming a jockey is really like a real elevation. For him, becoming a cabbie, a London cab driver, that's like a classic working class occupation in London in the post-war period, a service worker, because there ain't any jobs left. So the idea is that people's image of what is possible in their life comes from their position of birth. Anybody else want to say that this looked really different to them? The thing I'm really interested in here is that one of the key ways in which we think about class, particularly if you've grown up watching American TV and all of those dreadful masterpiece theatre versions of Britain, is that the thing that's really, really evident in the early films is that the elite groups talk terribly, terribly, terribly well, and the working class people talk like they really, come from the East End of London. That's a really bad Cockney accent, but by the end of the film, i.e., by the time they reach 59 or 49 or 56, are those accents as noticeable to you? Do people look and sound differently? I mean, obviously they do because they're 50 years older or 40 years older, but do the way in which they present themselves as a member of a certain class look different? Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Eric, you were going to say. Yeah, Tony pretty much sticks with his accent, but I think many of the middle class people or the people of the elite, and I'm thinking of people like Susie, who's the woman whose parents die and she her dog kills a rabbit in the garden when they're interviewing her, which I love. That's one of my favourite scenes, and who ends up marrying a lawyer and looking at being a stay-at-home mum, and ends up actually being a bereavement counsellor. And she is educated in a private school. She does ballet, she does horse riding, all the things that upper middle class women do. And yet by the end of the program, she sounds really just pretty much like Jackie or Lynn or any of the working class people that had come out of the East End. So there is a real flattening of those types of differences in terms of presentation. But it's really, I think, significant that the children of the working class kids in this series, none of their kids go on to university. Not a single one of them. Whereas all of the ones from the higher social groups basically continue to have access to that world. That's a pretty fundamental and important important difference. The other thing that I think is really, really interesting, and I'll pick up next week, is that there's a really interesting shift in the film in the way in which it ceases to be about the experience of class, the sort of social and economic experience of class, and becomes increasingly about a type of emotional literacy. So they talk from 42 up onwards, they are much more having a conversation about feelings and about relationships with husbands or with parents in a completely different type of way. And bear in mind that those are the years when reality TV begins to also take bite. So I want you to think of this series as very much part of position between this debate about class and classlessness that begins in the 1950s and the 1960s, but also part of all of these cultural projects that I've been talking about, which try and represent class to people, to try and to show, well, look, this is class experience. This show is a really good illustration of both of those things. And if you haven't watched all of one of them, I really suggest that you do, because it's very powerful stuff and has been widely mimicked elsewhere in the world. Lots of other countries now have their own spin-off versions of the Up series. Okay, well, look, thank you for your patience. And next week, I think we head to the 60s and the 1970s, and then we're almost done. It's like the end of the semester beckons.